In this video, I'm going to show you how I set up production-ready Django projects for massively scalable platforms. I've been working on Django projects for over a decade now, and I've designed the parts of this course very specifically so that you can get the absolute most out of them. So what I recommend here is that you work through each of the parts of this course in order, but then at any point if you missed some information or you want to revisit something, go back and revisit it. But I highly recommend getting through all of it first. So to follow along, you can simply follow along whilst you're watching this video, or I will put this ReadMe file which has all of the step-by-step instructions and all of the code snippets on the Code Creations GitHub page, which will also be linked down below as well. So the first thing that I'm going to go through is just a quick overview and some prerequisites. So at the time of creation, it is the 26th of September 2025, and the latest version of Django is, I think, Django 5.2. So we will be using Django 5.2, which comes with a whole bunch of new exciting features as well. And on top of that, I recommend using as late a version of Python as possible. So once again, at the time of writing, Python 3.13 is a good choice. So make sure that you have Python 3.13 installed. On top of that, as you may already be familiar with, I'm currently using Visual Studio Code as the integrated development environment. Now, there are many other choices that you could use. You could use something like Atom or PyCharm, and they all work pretty similarly. So please make sure that you have an IDE downloaded and ready to use. So now let's set up our environment. The very first thing that we need to do is create a directory. Now in my case, I've already created this directory and I've opened up the Visual Studio Code repository at this directory. So the next thing I need to do is open up a terminal. So if I come to terminal and up here, this terminal within Visual Studio Code or within any IDE that you're using is going to be your best friend. You'll use it for management commands within Django, and you'll use it for a whole bunch of other useful stuff as well. So let me just check the Python version first of all, and you can see that I'm using Python 3.13.7, so that's good. So let me come out of this, let me just clear the terminal. Here we go, now we can start from fresh. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a virtual environment. I can do this very simply by running this command here. So the first part of this command, venv, is basically telling Python to run this package, this program, and then the second command is the name of the virtual environment that you're going to create. Now in this example, let's just follow along with the snippets in the README file. We're going to create a .venv folder. Now in this example, we're going to follow along with the examples in the README file, and we're going to name the virtual environment .venv. So if I run this command, you'll see that .venv folder is now created, and that's now finished. So now what we need to do is we need to activate this virtual environment, which essentially means that we're now working within an isolated part of our computer. Rather than installing all of the packages and all the dependencies of this Django project system-wide, we're going to be installing everything in a very nice, tight, concise virtual environment, which just means that our project is going to be really nice and simple to package up. So to activate the virtual environment, I'm using Windows right now, but obviously the command is fairly similar on Mac. We're going to write source venv scripts, or sorry, needs to do .venv scripts and then activate. And now I'm working within my virtual environment because you can see that it is at the start of the command prompt here. Good, that's the first step. That's pretty simple, to be honest. Now what we want to do is we can upgrade the pip package inside of the virtual environment. Let's just run this command. That looks fine. Pip is essentially the package manager that we're going to use to install all of the different packages. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to install Django. Now, there's a few ways that you can do this. You can create a requirements file, which we will do anyway, and you can put your requirements in that requirements file. Or what I'm going to do is I'm going to just install Django from the command line, and I'm going to see which version it installs. So pip install Django. This will also install a whole bunch of other dependencies that Django has as well. But you can see here that it's installed Django version 5.2.6. That's great. And now what I can do is, because I'm in the virtual environment, I can now actually freeze the requirements, freeze the packages within this virtual environment to a requirements.txt file with this command here. So pip freeze and then pointing towards requirement.txt file. This is going to output all of the packages that I've now installed into a requirements file. And you can see here Django 5.2.6. and the other dependencies that it has as well. So that's great. And then we can just double check this version just by running this command as well. 5.2.6 as expected. So that's brilliant. So in terms of setting up our projects, we've kind of got everything that we need to actually start creating our Django project now. And the way that we can do this is by running this command here. We're going to enter a Python shell. We're going to run the Django commands, so we're going to use the Django package. Within Django, there's a whole bunch of management commands that you can use, and one of them is this start project command, which essentially builds all of the scaffolding that you'll need for a Django project. And then this last command essentially is just the name of what you're going to call this project. And then finally, this dot basically just tells it to install it here. So let's run this command. And as you can see, we have this config folder here, and within this config folder, we have a whole bunch of files. So the main files that I'm going to focus on are the settings.py and the urls.py. This WSGI and this ASGI are more related to the routing of the Django server, and are especially useful when you're looking at some of the more advanced topics that we'll cover later on in the course. But in settings.py, this is essentially a file that stores all of the core settings for your Django project. So it includes things such as your static file repository or your static file directory. It manages what the default ID fields are, manages things like internationalization, so language codes, time zones, validation for passwords, your database connection, middleware that's going to be used, and so on and so forth. So this is a really useful file that we'll come back to throughout the course. And the urls.py, this is essentially a centralized point where you can manage all of the URLs for your Django project. Once again, we will revisit this many times as we go through this course. But for now, we don't really need to do anything. So what your project should look like now is something like this. And essentially, this is pretty much what I'm showing here on the left-hand side as well. So that's perfect. If your directory looks like this so far, then you're doing a great job. So now that we've created the bare bones scaffolding of our server, let's just run some checks and let's just run the server just to make sure that everything is working fine. So once again, Django comes with so much built-in functionality. You can by all means use other frameworks to build the same functionality, but what you'll find is that you'll often be building something from scratch that already exists in Django. So there's so much nice built-in functionality that you can leverage in the form of management commands and frameworks. So when I run this command here, so python manage.py and then check, when I use the manage.py command after a Python command, I'm invoking a management command that comes built in within Python. So if I run this, you can see that it's identified no issues, which is great. So keep coming back and running this command if you ever want to check anything in terms of the health of your server. And then what we can do is, rather than run check, we can run server. So this is actually going to run our server for us. Now our server is currently running. It's running on localhost at port 8000, which is standard for a Django server. So this run server command runs a development server. This is not the command that you should use when you're running a server in production. So it's really useful when you're just testing locally, but when you move to production, you need to make use of the WSGI or the ASGI server instead, which is what I mentioned before. And these are sort of like production grade servers that you can use that won't just break if there is an error on the server. They'll be very robust and you can apply rules and all sorts of configurations to them. But the one thing that catches my eye here is this error in red. So you currently have 18 unapplied migrations. So what does this mean? Well, we're going to move on to this very shortly. But first, let's open up the URL to this server and let's see what's actually happening here. So you can see here, this is the location of the server. So let me just open this up. You can see it's opened up in here. And it's basically just taking me to like a boilerplate Django website that's already packaged up and installed as part of the installation. So that's great. If you see this page when you're running your server, then that means that everything has worked successfully. So that's great. If you need any additional documentation or anything like that, you can also go to some of these links down at the bottom too. So now coming back to the models. So in order to understand what a model is, you sort of need to understand how Django works. Django is a back-end framework. It's a server, essentially. So what does a server do? Well, a server serves content to the internet or to a client of some sort. So when an incoming request comes to our Django server, the Django server will respond with something. Now, depending on what sort of project or what sort of business you're running, you'll want your Django server to respond back to that incoming request with some sort of information, perhaps some data or even some content. And that content might be personalized to the person that's making the request, or maybe even the location where that request is coming from. So then begs the question, okay, well, where does this content or this data come from? And this is where models come in. So within your Django project, you can set up models, which are essentially database tables. And the reason why it's referred to as models is because Django is generally built on an MVC architecture, which means Model View Controller architecture. Now, as I said, Django comes built in with a whole bunch of functionality which you don't really have to worry about, which is why it's coming up with this error here. It's basically telling us that we have 18 unapplied migrations. And when it's referring to migrations here, it means updates in the database. And these updates are inbuilt tables that come packaged when you install Django. So what we need to do, and it actually even tells you in the error here, you can literally just run this command, python manage.py migrate, to apply them. So in order to do this, I'm going to stop the server. I'm going to run these two commands. I could just run this single command, but I'm going to run this one as well. So this first command, essentially what it does is it checks all of your Python files to see if there are any new updates to the database tables. Now at the moment we haven't actually manually created any database tables, so the only updates that it can apply are the ones that Django comes packaged with already. So when I run this command, it's probably going to come back saying no changes detected, exactly, because we haven't manually made any changes to the database tables. But now this second command is going to actually migrate the updates and apply them to our database. So if I run this, you'll see a whole bunch of output here. These are basically the migrations running, and you'll get success messages as well. So let me just open this up a bit more quickly. So basically what this is saying is that there are 18 different migrations that are being applied to our database right now. So it's creating all of these updates and additions to our database for us. So you can see by the prefixes of some of these migrations, there's some that begin with admin, there's some that begin with content types, auth, sessions, and we'll dive into these as we go on throughout the course. But just elaborating on what I said earlier, things like authentication, for example, it's already built in, it's already there within Django, and a lot of people don't actually maximize it or even use it in any capacity. An admin dashboard, it's already there in Django. Sessions, once again, already there. So what I'm going to show you throughout this course is really how to maximize all of these things. So that's great, we've migrated all of these models now. But you may be asking a question, and I would be asking this same question if I was in your position as well. Right, so we've migrated these models, and we've created these tables in a database, but what database are we using? Like, we haven't set up a database or anything like that. And you may have noticed when you ran that command that a new file was created in your directory, and it's this db.sqlite. So, by default, if you go into the settings.py file within the config folder, and if you scroll down and you look for databases, by default, out of the box, Django will use a SQLite database. Now this is really useful when testing local projects and when prototyping really quickly. SQLite is actually one of the most popular databases across the internet, and you'd be surprised how many production-ready systems actually use SQLite. Now typically how I do it is I use SQLite when I'm prototyping and when I work locally on my own machine, because it's really easy to create and destroy and tear up and tear down whenever you need to. But when I'm moving into a dev, staging or prod environment, I'll use a remote managed database, something like Postgres deployed on AWS or GCP, for example. So even though we didn't have to do anything, even though we didn't have to declare a database, Django already creates a database for you. And I'm going to show you a little trick actually. So if you're working in VS Code, there is actually a SQLite extension that you can use. So if you come up into the top toolbar up here and you press this button, and then you go to SQLite Open Database, and you choose which database you want to use, it will create this new tab in the Explorer on the left hand side. If you open this up and then open up the database, you can now actually see all of the database tables that have been created, and you can open these up as well. So as an example, I mean most of these are going to be empty, but some of them will have some content in them. So if I open up this one as an example, yeah, there's no data in there. Let's try and find one that there's actually some data in. Okay, nothing in there too. Admin log. Content type, this will have something. Right, okay. So this is just some sort of like boilerplate standard stuff that comes in this table, but you can actually inspect the tables here as well, which is quite nice. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview of the models. Enough to keep going for now at least anyway. Now, so far we have just created our config folder. The config folder in this case is going to store all of the important settings and configurations for our Django project. Now, the way that Django projects are organized they're organized into apps, and there's many different ways that you can organize your Django project. For example, you can logically organize your Django project into apps. So maybe you're building a social media site and you want an app for the profiles, you want an app for the content, you want an app for reactions, and maybe that makes logical sense. But then in another situation, maybe you're building a website for a publishing client and maybe they want much more granular apps. So not so much following a hierarchy, but more sort of following a much more granular or modular fashion. Now, in my experience, I find that it does vary case by case, but there are some apps that I'll always want to create within my Django project. And then it will be case by case basis, but I like to organize my apps in a logical fashion. So I generally like to create apps with more sort of general top level names. And then within those apps, then I'll have granular details that can follow a hierarchy. So as an example, if I go back to the social media case, I like to separate things out at the top level. So as an example, profiles, content, reactions, media. And then within each of those, so within the content, I'll then have posts, stories, pages, and so on and so forth. Now, before we worry about all of that, the first thing that we want to set up is our first app, which we're going to call core. And this core app is going to store core information that can be used by all of the other apps going forwards. And I find this to be a really useful first app to create. So by running this command, once again, we're using a management command, which is the start app command. And then by giving the name of the app after this, so that's core, running this, that will create a core folder here. And once again, it comes with all of this boilerplate information that we might need. Now, the second thing that we need to do, once you create an app, if you go back to your settings.py file, the way that Django keeps track of any changes within each of the apps is by monitoring this installed apps variable. Now, the reason why Django out of the box knew that there were migrations that needed to be migrated for all of those different apps that were built in was because all of those apps were listed within the installed apps list. So if you did start a project and actually you didn't need authentication, then you could just comment this out or you could get rid of it. So what we need to do is we need to add our new app into the installed apps list. So we can simply just come in here and write core. Now we know that the name of this app is core because that's the name that the folder was named after. Alternatively, what you can do is you can come into your newly created app, you can go into the apps.py file, and the name of the app will be within this class under the attribute called name. So you could actually change this if you wanted to. You could call it core, I don't know, extension or something like that. But in this case, we don't need to change it. It's good to keep it simple. Okay, so that's pretty much everything that we need to do there. Then what we're going to do is we're going to create our own custom model. So this is going to be building on top of the models that have already been automatically created. So let me close this folder, and now we want to focus within the core folder. Notice that a models.py file has already been created, but if we open this up, it will be empty. So it's ready for us to start populating. So what we're going to do is you can copy this snippet here and paste it into this file. So this is a very basic example of a model. And throughout this course, I will be showing you how to create much more sophisticated models. But in this example, this model essentially is going to be a note. This note could be used in a variety of different ways. But the way that you write a model typically is by using classes. So you give the class a name. In this example, it will be called note. And then you declare the schema that you want this database table to follow. So you give the class all these different properties. So for example, each note is going to have a title, a body, and a created at date. And then you tell the schema what the data type of this field is going to be. So in this case, title is going to be a character field with a max length of 200. Body is going to be a text field, and created at is going to be a date time field. Now if you're using VS Code, you'll notice as I'm hovering over this, it gives essentially documentation on this particular data type. But if you wanted more information, you can simply go to Django model types, model field reference, here we go. On this page here, it will give you information about all of the different types of fields that you can possibly use. However, there is a lot of information here. So throughout this course, I will be showing you a whole range of advanced and some of the more simpler field types as well. And this last method here, this is an inbuilt method, but essentially we're just overwriting it. Basically what it does is it assigns a string representation to each of the objects that will get stored as a note. So let's just say we're looking through a list of all of the notes. basically what it will do is it will show us the title of each of the notes rather than showing us all of the information about all of the notes. It allows us to have flexibility over the string representation of any individual note. So in this case, each note will be represented by its title. So creating a model, creating a database table is actually really simple. And because everything is declared in these classes, it makes it very clear and easy to update and create new ones as well. So now that we've created our class, that doesn't mean that it's all of a sudden automatically put into the database. What we need to do is we need to make the migrations that we've just created. So we need to run this command here, and then we need to migrate that change into the database. So what we can do is, let me just copy this part of the first command. So this is what we ran last time. If you run this command as it is, what it will do is it will go through all of the different app folders, which in this case is just 2. It will look for any additional changes, and then it will make those changes. But if we add the core at the end, then it will only search specifically the core app. So let's do this, and you'll notice that it's found a new change within the database and it's created a new migration. Now when a migration has been created, it actually creates a physical file within your file system. And you can see that it's referenced here. So if I open this file up, this is essentially what Django is automatically generating when you run this make migrations command. Now you don't necessarily need to understand everything that's going on in here. But essentially, this is kind of like an audit log that Django uses to keep track of all of the changes that happen in the database. Now, the reason why this is so powerful is because if, for example, you create a breaking change in your database, you can roll back your migrations to an existing version. But also, what Django does is it keeps track of all the dependencies within the database as well. So when it comes to destroying and recreating databases, it knows exactly in which order it needs to create all the tables in order for them to all work in harmony. Now you can come in here and you can actually make your own manual migrations as well. Let's just say you wanted to do some more advanced stuff within these migrations. You can do that. But in general, Django does a really good job of managing all of these migrations for you. So you don't generally need to touch them. So anyway, we've created the migration, and these migrations get stored in the database as well. And now all we need to do is we need to migrate these changes now. So I'll just delete this part and I'll write migrate. Notice that it's running migrations and it's applied this new migration, which refers to this file here. Notice the naming. So now if I refresh this, you'll see a new database table has been created. And if I open this up, once again, it'll be empty, but it will start populating data in here as we create notes. So that's great. We've created a new database table within the core app. Now, one thing that you may have noticed, if I go back to the config folder and into the URLs folder, you may have noticed that when we generated this app, the only URL in the URLs folder was a URL to an admin page. Now, I've mentioned it a few times, but Django comes with an extremely powerful admin panel already built in. It's highly customizable and it's massively valuable. Now, by default, there won't really be very much in this admin panel. So let's actually have a look at it now. So if I come back to my web browser and I go to /admin, it can't be reached because my server isn't actually running. Let's run the server again. Okay, now let's go back to the browser and refresh this. Right, so the admin panel is intended for privileged users and it's asking me to log in. The only problem is we haven't created any users yet. So we'll come back to this afterwards. So let's come back to the tutorial. So what we need to do now, once again, we can't view anything in admin.py yet, but we will be able to in just a few more steps. But in order to see something within this admin panel, we'll already be able to see some of the inbuilt pre-made models that the admin has already created for us. But for the new model that we've just created, what we need to do is we need to register this model in the admin.py file within the core folder. So if I open up admin.py, once again, it'll be empty. But what I can do, if I just copy this snippet and put it into admin, and let me tell you what's going on here. So basically what we're doing here is within the admin file, we're importing the note model, and then we're registering this model to the admin panel. And we're just creating a class which essentially will inherit all of the different properties that come from this admin class up here. So we won't have to worry too much about customizing this. There is an extremely large amount of customization that we can do, which I'll cover in some later lessons. But just to get this note database table visible in the admin panel, you can start with something very simple like this. So essentially what these two properties are doing is this is telling the admin page for the notes what fields within the note model do we want to be able to see when we're listing all of the notes. So in this case, we just want to see the title and the created at date. if I go to the model very quickly, yeah, we probably don't want to see the body because that could be quite a long field. And then we're also declaring search fields as well. So at the top of the admin panel, you'll have a search bar. So what we're telling the admin panel here is that we would like to be able to search the notes by the title. You could also say body here as well. So basically what that means is if I go to the search bar and I type in amazing news, then that string amazing news will be used and Django will search both the title and the body for that string to then return all of the relevant notes. Right, so I can save that now. That's not a problem. We've registered that in the admin panel. Now, once again, if I go back to the admin panel, I can't really do anything here because I need to log in, right? It's kind of gatekeeping me right now from actually seeing anything that I've created within Django. So in order to access this, I need to create a username and password. But we're not just going to be creating any old user. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a super user. So a super user in this case is a power user. A power user that is considered to be a staff member and has ultimate privileges over all of the information within the admin panel. So typically you'll want to be very careful about who you create these super users for. But once you've created the first super user, you can create more super users from the admin panel. And you can actually delegate all different types of permissions to those users as well. But to create that very first super user, what I'm going to do is paste that command in. Once again, this is a management command. And the management command is create super user. So let's run this. It will now ask me a whole bunch of questions for this super user. So in this case, I'm going to call it admin. Email address. You can obviously put your real email address, but I'm just going to put admin@example.com. Password. I'm just going to put something very simple. Okay, so the password's matched. The super user is now created. Great. So remember that super user because you'll need to reference that again. What you can do, in fact, is if you want to remember this and you want to put it in a safe place, come to the root of your folder, create a new file, call it .env, which stands for an environment variables file. I will cover this more as we go throughout the course, but then what you can do is you can just save some variables in here called admin username equals admin. Now obviously you wouldn't want to make this environment variables file publicly available like I am doing in this video. However, because I'm running it locally, it's safe. Like nobody can log into this server. And once again, it's just a test server anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So in this case, I've just created a very simple password, password123 exclamation mark, and the username is admin. So I can save it in here. That's really just for my own reference that I'll come back to. And let's go to the Django page now. I need to run the server, otherwise nothing's going to work. So the server's running. Let's just refresh this. That looks fine. Username, admin, password, PASSWR. Okay, I'm in. Great. So notice my Notes app is here. Just to demonstrate this and show this a little bit more, let me just delete all of this and rerun the server. And then if I refresh my page, notice the notes registration within the admin panel is non-existent. So that's why you need to register your models within the admin panel. If you create a model and you actually don't want to include it in the admin panel, then you don't need to create this little admin registration. But if you create a model and you want to see it in the admin panel, then you have to do this. You can also see that you can view some of the authentication and authorization models that have been automatically created as well. So if you go into the users page, you'll see the super user that you've created. And if you come into here, you can do a whole bunch of things. You can reset their password, you can set their first name, last name. Notice that these permissions here, this is what defines a super user essentially. Not only are you a staff member, but you have super user status, which means that you have all the permissions without explicitly assigning them. So once again, you want to do this fairly sparingly. But if I come over to the notes, you'll notice that nothing's here, and that's because I haven't created any notes yet. But when I do create notes, I'll be able to see them in this admin panel. So let's come back to the README file. So we've created our super user and we can now actually view the admin panel, which is great. So the last thing that we're going to do in this getting started tutorial is we're going to create a very simple view and we're going to allocate this to a URL. Now a view is essentially an endpoint that a request will get routed to. So as an incoming request comes into our Django server, the Django server will look at that request and will say, okay, which endpoint is this request intended for? And if there is an endpoint within the Django application that matches the request that it's intended for, then it will go to that endpoint, it will build its response, and then it will send its response back to that request. So the place where you manage all of these endpoints is in your views.py file. So within the core app, I'm going to open up views.py. Once again, it will be empty for now. And I'm going to create this very simple view. And this very simple view is literally just in the form of a function. Going forwards, when we do some of the more advanced stuff, we'll be using class-based views. But once again, just to get started, this is absolutely fine. So what's happening here? So we've created a function which is going to be an endpoint. And essentially, when a request hits this endpoint, the endpoint is going to return straight away a response back with literally just the word Pong. And this class here that we import just packages up this response to make sure that it's a valid HTTP response. So we have this endpoint, but at the moment, we have no way of reaching this endpoint because we haven't told our Django server how to route to this endpoint. So what we now need to do is if we go into config/URLs, as I told you before, this is the central point where we can manage all of the endpoints and the routing for the project. So what we can do here is we can import our function from the core views file. So we're importing from core, from views, we're importing the ping function. And then on the line underneath admin, we are creating a path which then essentially tells Django this is a new endpoint that you can route to if somebody actually comes to this page on the server. So what will happen if somebody goes to localhost/ping, it will route to the ping function and it will send back this response here. So very simple. Once again, this is just for demonstration purposes. We'll be getting into some much more advanced view logic as we go on. So now that we've routed our Django application to this function, let's go to our web browser again. And rather than going to the admin panel, let's now replace this with ping. Now notice if I do it without a /, it appends it automatically. And you can see it returns back Pong. So it literally just returns us a HTTP page with the word Pong on it. And if you look in the logs down here as well, so when you run the python manage.py run server command, in the terminal from that point on, you get logs about exactly what's happening in the server. So you can see here that somebody tried to make a request to /ping, so without the / at the end, and then it actually sent back a 301 response, which essentially means that it redirected it to this one. So it redirected it automatically to /ping and then / at the end, and it gives a HTTP 200 response. So that rounds up everything that I was going to cover in this first part of the series. So just to recap exactly what we did very quickly. So we set up our Python environment, we created our project, we then just made sure that the Python environment had passed all the checks and we ran that server. We created our own models, so our own database tables within this Django server, and we migrated all of those models as well as the inbuilt ones as well to populate the database. Then we created our first app, which was the core app. We registered that app in the installed apps list, created our own custom model. We saw that custom model in the admin panel and we created a super user for us to be able to view that. And then we actually created a very simple endpoint as well. So this has essentially given us everything that we need as a foundation for setting up your Django project. Part 2 is going to be focused more on the models, and we're going to be diving into some much more advanced topics around models as well. So if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, leave us a comment to let us know what you enjoyed. Hit that notification bell as well so that you're notified when the next part of the series comes out. And whilst you're here, why not check out my previous video that I did on Django, which basically goes through some of the more advanced features and why these are so important to building production-ready applications. This will actually be a great insight if you're planning on following along for the rest of this course. But apart from that, I'll see you soon.